June 12, 1944. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont sat 3 kilometers inland from Utah Beach, its ancient stone houses casting long shadows in the pre-dawn light that filtered through the morning mist rolling in from the English Channel. The air carried the distinct smell of salt water, mixed with the acrid smoke from fires still burning along the coast, remnants of the massive invasion that had transformed this quiet corner of Normandy 6 days earlier. The village, home to fewer than 800 souls before the conflict, had swollen with military personnel, refugees, and the chaos of armies in motion. In the kitchen of the requisitioned Château Beaumont, a sprawling 17th-century manor house that overlooked the village square and had served as headquarters for German occupation forces for 11 months, 42 officers from the 709th Infantry Division gathered for what they believed would be another routine morning briefing, completely unaware that within 72 hours, not one of them would remain in this village where they had confidently expected to make their defensive stand against the Allied advance pushing inland from the beaches. They had survived the initial chaos of the invasion that had begun before dawn on June 6th. They had witnessed the sky fill with parachutes, the beaches erupt with landing craft, and the carefully prepared defensive positions along the coast overwhelmed by sheer force of numbers and firepower. They had retreated in relatively good order to secondary positions, regrouped, and prepared to conduct the kind of defensive operations that professional soldiers understood. They were experienced men, most of them veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, North Africa, or the brutal Eastern Territories. They believed in their training, their tactical doctrine, and their ability to make the Americans pay dearly for every kilometer of French soil. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these officers could have imagined, what their training and experience had not prepared them for, was that their disappearance from this French village would be orchestrated not through combat operations, not through artillery barrages or armored assaults, but through the methodical planning and execution of a 38-year-old mess cook from Baltimore, Maryland, a black American corporal named James Washington, armed with nothing more sophisticated than a kitchen knife, a profound understanding of human psychology, an exceptional talent for logistics that the military had never properly recognized, and an opportunity that history had accidentally placed directly into his weathered, capable hands. Corporal James Washington had arrived in Normandy on June 7th, coming ashore with the 327th Quartermaster Service Company, one of the relatively few African-American units to land during the first critical week of the invasion, when priorities focused almost exclusively on combat troops and their immediate support. His official military occupational specialty was listed as cook, a designation that reflected less about his actual capabilities and more about the racial policies that determined how black soldiers were utilized regardless of their qualifications. His role, as the Army defined it, involved preparing adequate meals for American forces advancing through the Norman countryside. His unofficial role, the one that would actually matter in the days to come, began the precise moment he stepped through the heavy oak door into the chateau's industrial kitchen and found it still radiating residual warmth from recent use, still fully stocked with supplies, and still arranged exactly as the German kitchen staff had left it during their hasty retreat to defensive positions in the village center when American forces had arrived. The kitchen itself told elaborate stories to anyone trained to read them. 20-kilogram sacks of white flour, each one carefully dated May 1944 and stamped with the seal of a mill in Carentan, stood stacked 5 high against the eastern wall. Preserved meats hung from iron hooks in the walk-in cold room, enough salted pork, smoked sausages, and cured beef to feed a full company for 3 weeks without resupply. Cooking oil filled 2 dozen 5-liter tins arranged on heavy wooden shelving. Sugar, salt, dried vegetables, preserved fruits, coffee substitutes made from roasted grains, and hundreds of other items filled the pantry, in quantities that suggested the German command had been planning for an extended occupation. Most importantly, tucked into a leather binder on the chief cook's desk, Washington discovered a detailed inventory ledger written in precise Germanic script, listing every single item in the kitchen, every scheduled delivery, every supplier from the surrounding countryside, complete with names, addresses, and the carefully noted reliability of each source. Washington stood at the massive oak preparation table that dominated the kitchen's center, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, running his weathered hands across the cutting boards that bore the knife marks of countless meals. He understood immediately, with the kind of instant recognition that comes from years of working with complex systems, exactly what he was looking at. This was not simply a kitchen designed to feed soldiers. This was an intelligence archive, a comprehensive map of local supply networks, a detailed documentation of German logistical operations, and a window into how occupation forces had integrated themselves into the French countryside. The inventory ledger alone represented hundreds of hours of potential intelligence work, listing every farmer who had supplied produce, every merchant who had provided dry goods, every contact point between German forces and French civilians. Captain Friedrich Holzer of the 709th Division's 2nd Battalion, the officer who had commanded the chateau's occupation for the previous 11 months, had been 46 years old and represented the older generation of professional soldiers who had already served with distinction in the First Great Conflict and found themselves, somewhat reluctantly and with private reservations, they rarely voiced, serving in this second one. His daily journal, which American forces later recovered from the chateau's study, along with detailed maps and operational orders, revealed a man deeply uncomfortable with many aspects of his service, but absolutely committed to his military duty, regardless of personal feelings. The journal entries from early June showed his careful attention to logistical details, his concern for his men's welfare, and his professional assessment of tactical situations. On June 11th, just one day before Washington arrived, Holzer had written that the chateau would serve as a temporary command post while defensive positions were reinforced and communication lines re-established. He noted with what seemed like genuine relief that American forces appeared primarily focused on consolidating and expanding the beachhead rather than immediately pushing deep inland. This assessment, professionally sound based on available information, gave him confidence that his unit would have time to prepare adequate defenses. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the American kitchen staff now occupying his former headquarters would pose any threat whatsoever beyond the mundane challenge of preparing field rations. Washington's immediate commanding officer, Lieutenant Robert Morrison, was a 24-year-old recent graduate from a small college in Ohio who had completed officer training school exactly 9 weeks before his unit shipped overseas. Morrison represented the wartime reality of rapid military expansion, where young men with minimal experience found themselves responsible for complex operations. His understanding of military protocol was textbook perfect, drilled into him through intensive training. His understanding of how conflicts were actually won, how logistics shaped strategy, how intelligence operations actually functioned in the field, was still very much developing through direct experience. When Washington formally requested permission to maintain the chateau's kitchen as a fully operational mess facility, rather than simply converting it into a basic field kitchen with portable equipment, Morrison approved the request without extended consideration. The logic seemed entirely obvious to him. Hot meals prepared in proper facilities improved soldier morale significantly. The building was secure, the equipment was already in place, and utilizing existing resources made tactical sense. What Morrison could not know, because Washington had not yet explained and would never fully explain, was that maintaining the kitchen's full operation would serve two entirely distinct purposes, only one of which involved actually feeding American soldiers. The first German officers began returning to the chateau on June 13th, not as free men conducting military business, but as prisoners requiring processing and secure detention. They came because Lieutenant Hans Becker, a 29-year-old reconnaissance officer who had been captured during a patrol that encountered American positions unexpectedly, had been brought to the chateau's makeshift holding area for initial interrogation and documentation. The military police sergeant responsible for handling prisoner intake was named Thomas Garrett, a 32-year-old former sheriff's deputy from rural Pennsylvania, who found himself completely overwhelmed by the pace of operations. He was attempting to process and secure 17 newly captured prisoners with a staff of exactly 4 military policemen, all of them exhausted from continuous operations since the invasion began. The prescribed procedures for prisoner documentation required detailed personal information, verification of military status, initial interrogation to determine intelligence value, and secure detention pending transfer to rear area facilities. Garrett was conducting this process in a commandeered barn with inadequate supplies and zero proper facilities. Washington, observing this chaotic situation with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years managing complex logistics at the Baltimore Port Authority, recognized both a problem and an opportunity. He approached Sergeant Garrett with a suggestion that appeared entirely helpful and completely innocent. The chateau possessed a wine cellar, he explained, a substantial underground room with thick stone walls, a single reinforced entrance that could be easily guarded, excellent natural ventilation, and absolutely no windows that might facilitate escape attempts. The space could comfortably hold 20 men, perhaps more if necessary. It would be significantly more secure and humane than the makeshift arrangements currently in use. Garrett, grateful for any assistance and impressed by Washington's practical thinking, agreed immediately. The wine cellar was emptied of its remaining bottles, furnished with basic bedding materials, and prepared for use as a detention facility. This represented Washington's first strategic move in an operation he was already planning, though nobody else recognized it as such, because it appeared to be nothing more than sensible problem-solving. In the ancient game of chess developed centuries ago in India and Persia, the opening gambit often appears entirely innocuous to inexperienced players. A single pawn advances 2 squares. Nothing dramatic occurs. The board state changes only minimally, but experienced players recognize that this simple move begins establishing control of the center, creates possibilities for piece development, and sets the stage for combinations that will only become apparent many moves later. In military operations, particularly intelligence operations, the same fundamental principle applies with equal force. The opening moves must appear routine, unremarkable, certainly not threatening. They must seem to serve obvious practical purposes. Their deeper strategic value must remain invisible until the operation is already well advanced. By the evening of June 13th, 23 German soldiers and officers occupied the chateau's wine cellar, guarded by 2 military police corporals who frankly felt relieved to have such an obviously secure location for their charges. The prisoners were fed regular meals from the kitchen, which Washington prepared personally, carefully adhering to Geneva Convention requirements. Potato soup with bread, ersatz, coffee made from roasted grain, portions that met international standards exactly. The prisoners ate. Some of them thanked Washington in broken English. Others remained silent, processing their new reality of captivity and uncertain futures. Oberst Martin Schreiber arrived as a prisoner on June 14th, when his regimental command post was overrun during an American advance. This brought the total prisoner count to 28. Schreiber represented exactly the kind of senior officer that intelligence personnel valued most highly. At 51 years old, he was a career professional soldier who had commanded troops successfully in Poland during the 1939 campaign, in France during the spring of 1940, and for 2 brutal years on the Eastern Front before his transfer to Normandy for what was supposed to be a quieter posting. His memoirs, which he eventually published in 1957 after years of reflection and writing, describe his first meal in American captivity with unexpected and illuminating detail. The soup, he wrote carefully, had been adequately prepared, not elaborate, but made with what seemed like reasonable care given field conditions. The bread had been fresh, still slightly warm, suggesting recent baking. The coffee, though obviously not real coffee, had been hot and drinkable. What struck Schreiber most powerfully, what he found himself thinking about repeatedly in the days that followed, was the cook himself, a black man, which Schreiber admitted with characteristic honesty he found initially shocking, given everything the propaganda machinery had taught him to expect about American society and its supposed racial hierarchies. The cook worked with quiet efficiency and evident professional competence, moving through his duties with the practiced economy of motion that marked skilled tradesmen everywhere. When Schreiber attempted to speak with him in his limited English, hoping perhaps to gauge his treatment or gather information about what would happen next. The cook simply nodded politely and continued his work without elaboration. What Schreiber could not have known, what none of the prisoners gathering in the wine cellar could have possibly known, was that Washington was not simply a cook fulfilling his assigned military duties. His life before the conflict had been spent working as a logistics coordinator for the Baltimore Port Authority, one of the busiest shipping facilities on the American East Coast, managing complex cargo manifests and distribution schedules for commercial vessels arriving from ports around the world. His mind naturally processed systems, supply chains, organizational structures, and information flows the way other men might process music or mathematical equations. He could look at seemingly chaotic arrangements and immediately perceive the underlying patterns, the inefficiencies, the vulnerabilities, the opportunities for optimization. The United States Army, operating under racial policies that had been established decades earlier and remained firmly entrenched, despite some pressure for reform, had assigned him to work as a cook because that was where they placed the vast majority of black soldiers, regardless of their actual qualifications, education, or demonstrated capabilities. Washington had accepted this assignment without protest or complaint, understanding that challenging such policies directly would accomplish nothing productive. Then he had proceeded quietly and methodically to transform his nominal role into something the Army had never intended and would probably never fully recognize. By June 16th, the wine cellar held 37 German prisoners, the steady flow of captured personnel increasing daily as American forces pushed deeper into the Norman countryside and encountered increasingly desperate resistance from isolated units attempting to delay the inevitable. The military police processing system was completely overwhelmed. Prisoners arrived faster than they could be documented, interrogated, and transported to rear area holding facilities in England, where permanent prisoner of war camps were being established. The wine cellar at the chateau, secure and adequately maintained, had become the temporary solution that everyone involved found acceptable. Nobody questioned it because there was no apparent reason for questions. Washington approached Lieutenant Morrison that evening with a request that seemed, like all his requests, entirely reasonable and obviously practical. The steadily increasing number of prisoners was placing strain on kitchen operations and on the military police personnel assigned to guard duty. Additionally, during casual conversations while delivering meals, several prisoners had mentioned previous experience in food service. This was not surprising, Washington explained to Morrison. German military doctrine, following traditions established in earlier conflicts, emphasized practical vocational training for all personnel. It was common for soldiers to have worked in various trades before conscription, including restaurant work, bakery operations, and large-scale food preparation. If Morrison approved, Washington suggested, he could organize a small prisoner work detail to assist with meal preparation. This would be conducted under continuous supervision, naturally. The work would be exclusively non-military in nature. The arrangement would free up American personnel for other duties while improving overall operational efficiency. Morrison considered this proposal briefly and then approved it without hesitation. The logic appeared entirely sound. The Geneva Convention explicitly permitted prisoner labor for non-military purposes, and food preparation clearly qualified as such work. Using prisoners for kitchen duties was actually standard practice in many military situations. The arrangement would benefit everyone involved. Morrison signed the authorization without any sense that he was enabling something beyond routine kitchen management. Washington selected 3 prisoners for the initial work detail. One of them was Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, who had previously served as the chief quartermaster officer for the entire 709th Division. Washington had identified Dietrich through a series of seemingly casual conversations during meal deliveries, asking innocent questions about military experience and previous occupations, listening carefully to responses, and gradually building a detailed understanding of each prisoner's background and expertise. Dietrich had been responsible for managing logistics for thousands of men. His knowledge of supply networks, transportation schedules, resource allocation procedures, and the practical realities of keeping military forces adequately supplied was encyclopedic and detailed. In the chateau kitchen, working side by side with the American corporal who was technically his captor, Dietrich began to talk, not about military secrets initially, not about classified information or operational details, but about the mundane everyday realities of logistics work, where flour came from in occupied France, which local mills were still operational after years of conflict. How the German supply system, stretched desperately thin by simultaneous operations across multiple fronts, improvised and adapted to chronic shortages. How transportation networks functioned when fuel was scarce and Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Washington listened attentively, asked questions that seemed purely professional in nature, questions that one logistics professional might ask another about the technical challenges of their shared field, and learned. Every piece of information represented another coordinate on the comprehensive map he was methodically building in his mind. A map that showed not just where supplies came from, but how the entire system functioned, where its vulnerabilities lay, how it might be further disrupted. The kitchen became a strange neutral space, where the formal hierarchies that structured military life grew blurred and indistinct. Dietrich, peeling potatoes alongside a black American corporal in a requisitioned French chateau, found himself discussing the relative merits of different bread-making techniques with surprising earnestness. Another prisoner, Feldwebel Hans Müller, who had worked in his family's well-regarded restaurant in Munich for 15 years before being conscripted, demonstrated the proper technique for clarifying stock, showing Washington how to skim impurities carefully to produce perfectly clear broth. The armed guard assigned to watch the work detail observed these interactions, but grew increasingly relaxed as days passed without incident. These were middle-aged men with flour on their hands, discussing cooking techniques and comparing recipes, not dangerous prisoners plotting escapes or sabotage. On June 18th, Washington made what would prove to be his second critical strategic move. He formally requested permission from Lieutenant Morrison to visit the weekly village market in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont's central square. The market, a tradition that had continued even during the German occupation, had cautiously resumed operations as civilians attempted to restore some sense of normalcy to their disrupted lives. Local farmers brought what they could spare from their limited stocks. Merchants offered goods salvaged from damaged shops. It was modest, smaller than before the invasion, but it represented life continuing. Morrison approved the request easily, assigning 2 soldiers as escort for security purposes. Washington spent 3 full hours in the market square that morning, purchasing vegetables, cheese, and butter for the kitchen. He also spent those same 3 hours talking extensively with French civilians who had endured 4 long years of German occupation and possessed detailed knowledge of which German officers had been reasonable in their treatment of locals, which had been genuinely cruel, and which had been corrupt, trading military supplies for personal enrichment. Marie Blanchard, a widow in her early 60s, who had successfully maintained the village bakery throughout the occupation, despite chronic flour shortages and endless regulations, proved particularly informative and helpful. She spoke passable English, learned decades earlier from her father, who had conducted regular trade with British merchants before the first great conflict had severed those commercial relationships. Standing beside her market stall, speaking in low tones, while her hands stayed busy arranging what few goods she had to sell, she told Washington about the German supply depot located 3 kilometers north of the village, a facility that had been abandoned so hastily during the initial retreat that significant stores of food, fuel, and equipment remained unsecured. She told him about the local French resistance cell that had been carefully documenting German positions and movements for months, information they were eager to share with Allied forces, but had no secure channel for transmission. And she told him, voice dropping even lower, about the underground network that had been successfully helping downed Allied pilots escape through France to neutral Spain, a network that still functioned and still possessed detailed knowledge of German security procedures and patrol patterns. Washington returned to the chateau that afternoon with 2 large baskets of fresh vegetables and an enormous quantity of actionable intelligence. That evening, sitting at the small desk in his quarters, he composed a carefully worded letter to Captain Theodore Williams of the 923rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, an African-American unit stationed approximately 8 kilometers away. Williams and Washington had met during the long months of training at Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, discovering shared backgrounds, similar experiences with military discrimination, and complementary skills. The letter discussed in seemingly mundane terms the possibility of coordinating supply deliveries between their units to improve efficiency. It also contained, written between the lines using a simple substitution code they had developed during training exercises, precise information about German defensive positions north of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, details about the abandoned supply depot, and notes about local civilian cooperation, all gleaned from Washington's conversations with prisoners and French civilians. By June 21st, the wine cellar held exactly 42 prisoners, the number that would become significant in later historical analysis. The final addition was Hauptmann Ernst Weber, a 33-year-old intelligence officer who had been attempting desperately to reach German lines and rejoin his unit when his vehicle was stopped at an American checkpoint. Weber held multiple decorations for service on the Eastern Front, possessed extensive training in intelligence analysis and counterintelligence operations, and remained deeply committed to his military duty, despite the increasingly obvious reality that Germany was losing the conflict. He was also exhausted to the point of collapse, severely malnourished from weeks of inadequate rations, and suffering from a serious infection in a wound on his left leg that had gone untreated for 5 days. Washington, bringing the evening meal to the wine cellar, as he did personally every day, noticed Weber's condition immediately, with the practiced eye of someone trained to observe details. He promptly informed the American medical officer, Captain David Richardson, who examined Weber and prescribed sulfur drugs to combat the infection, along with proper wound cleaning and bandaging. The treatment was entirely standard, required explicitly by Geneva Convention provisions for prisoner care. What happened next, however, extended well beyond standard operating procedures. Weber, recovering gradually over the following days, his fever breaking and his strength slowly returning, began speaking at length with Washington during the daily meal deliveries. Unlike the other prisoners, most of whom accepted their captivity with varying degrees of resignation, Weber actively sought conversation. He asked questions. Who was Washington? Where had he learned to cook? What had he done in civilian life before the conflict? Washington answered these questions honestly within appropriate limits. He had worked at the Baltimore Port Authority managing shipping logistics. He had always enjoyed cooking as a personal interest. He believed strongly in doing any job well, regardless of what that job might be or how one had come to be assigned to it. Weber listened carefully to these answers and eventually, as trust developed through repeated conversations, began sharing his own story. He had studied history and political science at Heidelberg University, one of Germany's most prestigious institutions. He had joined the military in the 1930s, believing genuinely in service to his country and in the necessity of defending German interests. He had served on the Eastern Front for 2 years, witnessing events there that had progressively shaken his faith in everything he had been taught to believe about ideology, about military honor, about the nature of the conflict itself. These conversations, conducted in the stone-walled wine cellar over meals prepared with increasing care as Washington's access to supplies improved, represented Washington's most delicate and potentially significant operation. He was not attempting to extract tactical military intelligence from Weber. Standard interrogation techniques, which Washington had observed military intelligence officers employing with other prisoners, focused on immediate tactical information, unit locations, strength assessments, defensive preparations, command structures. Washington was doing something far more subtle, far more complex and potentially far more important for long-term strategic outcomes. He was establishing through his actions and his treatment of prisoners that even in captivity, even in defeat, even when everything familiar had been stripped away, human dignity could be maintained and respected. This mattered profoundly because Washington understood something that would not become formal military doctrine for several decades. The treatment of prisoners during conflict directly shaped post-conflict reconstruction. Every German officer in that wine cellar would eventually, whether in months or years, return home to Germany. What they believed about America, about democracy, about the possibility of a different future beyond the failed ideology that had led them into this catastrophic conflict, would significantly influence the kind of Germany that eventually emerged from the ruins. On June 24th, Lieutenant Morrison received official orders to prepare all prisoners currently held at the Chateau for transport to a permanent rear area detention facility in England. The wine cellar would be completely emptied within 48 hours. All prisoners would be processed, documented, and loaded onto trucks for movement to the coast. Washington requested a private meeting with Morrison and arrived with a detailed proposition that he had been carefully constructing over the previous 12 days of observation and planning. The intelligence information gathered through his conversations with prisoners, he explained, combined with additional information obtained from French civilian sources, had provided an unusually detailed and comprehensive picture of German logistical positions and supply networks throughout the region. This information needed to reach appropriate intelligence officers before the prisoners were dispersed to various facilities. Additionally, several prisoners, particularly those with quartermaster and supply backgrounds, had expressed willingness to provide more extensive cooperation if the process was handled correctly and respectfully. Morrison, who had grown to respect Washington's organizational abilities and practical judgment, even if he did not fully understand the scope of what Washington had accomplished, listened carefully as Washington outlined a systematic debriefing approach. Each prisoner would be interviewed individually, focusing specifically on logistics and supply operations rather than tactical combat positions. The information gathered would be valuable for planning future operations, identifying supply vulnerabilities, and understanding how German forces maintain themselves in the field. Morrison, recognizing both the potential intelligence value and Washington's unexpected aptitude for this kind of analytical work, agreed to the proposal. He immediately contacted the division intelligence officer, Major Paul Henderson, who arrived at the chateau that same evening to assess the situation. Henderson had been initially deeply skeptical when Morrison explained that a mess cook had been conducting informal intelligence-gathering operations. A cook, performing intelligence work, but as Washington presented his comprehensive findings, carefully documented in a thick notebook filled with supply routes meticulously mapped, depot locations precisely identified, organizational charts of German logistics networks, drawn with professional clarity, and detailed notes about supply chain vulnerabilities, Henderson's skepticism underwent rapid transformation into genuine professional respect. This was not casual information casually gathered. This was actionable intelligence, detailed and credible, presented with analysis that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how logistics shaped military operations. Henderson spent the next 2 full days at the chateau, working directly with Washington to systematically debrief every prisoner who possessed relevant knowledge about supply operations, transportation networks, or resource allocation. The intelligence gathered during those intensive 2 days contributed significantly to American operations throughout the remainder of the Normandy campaign. Supply depots were located and secured before German forces could evacuate or destroy their contents. Transportation routes were identified and interdicted, further straining already overstretched German logistics. Critical supply nodes were targeted for disruption, creating cascading failures throughout the German supply network. The formal intelligence reports that documented these findings credited multiple sources in the standard bureaucratic language of military paperwork. Washington's name appeared nowhere in any official documentation. He simply returned to his regular kitchen duties, preparing meals for American soldiers and German prisoners alike, his contribution to military intelligence operations completely invisible in the formal record. The 42 German officers were transported to England on June 27th. Before their departure, Oberst Schreiber, the senior-ranking officer among the prisoners, formally requested through proper channels to speak briefly with Washington. Through a military translator, since Schreiber's English remained limited, he thanked Washington for the treatment that he and his men had received during their detention. The food had been adequate, he said, sometimes even better than adequate given field conditions. The living conditions had been acceptable and properly maintained. More importantly, far more importantly, they had been treated consistently as soldiers, as military professionals, not as representatives of a regime that many of them had grown to question privately. Schreiber asked with evident sincerity if Washington had any message he should carry back to Germany, whenever that eventual return might occur. Washington considered this question with obvious care, understanding its weight. Then he said, speaking slowly so the translator could render his words accurately, that all men deserved to be treated with fundamental human dignity regardless of circumstances. That he hoped when this terrible conflict finally ended, the German people would remember that Americans believed in justice and fair treatment, not in vengeance or cruelty. That the future did not have to be determined by the worst elements of the past. That reconciliation was possible if men of goodwill on both sides worked toward it. Schreiber listened to the translation, nodded slowly with what appeared to be deep emotion, and offered his hand. Washington shook it firmly. The military translator watched this exchange with visible surprise, clearly not expecting such a moment between captor and prisoner. The chateau's wine cellar stood empty by evening on June 27th. The 42 German officers had vanished from the French village, not into death or torture or some dark, uncertain fate, but into the established prisoner of war system that would eventually, after months or years of detention, return them to a Germany that would be dramatically transformed by defeat. Their disappearance from Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where they had genuinely expected to continue fighting and possibly dying in defense of positions they had prepared, represented something far more significant than simple battlefield capture. It represented a carefully orchestrated operation conducted with precision and purpose by a man whose official military role gave him absolutely no authority whatsoever to conduct such operations, whose racial identity meant the army had systematically underutilized his considerable talents, and whose contribution to the conflict would remain almost entirely unrecognized for decades. Lieutenant Morrison never fully understood what had actually occurred in the chateau kitchen under his nominal command. His diary entries from June 1944 noted that Corporal Washington had been unusually helpful with prisoner management issues and had shown unexpected aptitude for logistics coordination. The military police sergeant who had overseen the wine cellar detention facility noted in his reports that the prisoners had been unusually cooperative and that morale problems had been minimal compared to other facilities he had managed. The French civilians who had spoken extensively with Washington told stories among themselves, stories that would be passed down through families, about the American soldier who spoke terrible French with an accent they could barely understand, but who listened carefully and seemed to genuinely care about their experiences during the long occupation. The full scope and significance of Washington's operation only became clear years later, when military historians began systematically analyzing intelligence records from the Normandy campaign for academic study and official histories. A distinct pattern emerged from the documentary evidence: unusually detailed and accurate logistics intelligence from the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont area, information corroborated by multiple independent prisoner sources, all of it traced back to a concentrated 2-week period in June 1944. The intelligence had been properly credited in reports to various officers and official channels following standard military procedure. But the source documentation, when examined closely by researchers, showed consistent handwriting in the margins, notes about supply chain vulnerabilities written in the same hand, observations about German morale and unit cohesion, details about civilian cooperation networks and local knowledge, all of it in identical handwriting. All of it initialed simply J.W. Captain Theodore Williams, Washington's friend from training, who commanded a unit in the 923rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, later described in his personal memoirs receiving a series of letters during June 1944 that contained, cleverly hidden within seemingly mundane discussions of food service and supply coordination, some of the most valuable tactical and strategic intelligence his unit received during the entire European campaign. Williams had carefully passed this information through proper military intelligence channels, deliberately crediting anonymous local sources to protect Washington from potential disciplinary action for grossly exceeding his authority as a cook. After the conflict ended and both men had returned to civilian life in America, Williams asked Washington directly during a private conversation whether he had fully understood the personal and professional risks involved in what he had undertaken. Washington's response, entirely characteristic of his practical approach to problems, was straightforward. He had been given an unexpected opportunity through circumstances. He possessed skills and knowledge that were desperately needed. The Army had not asked him to use those skills for intelligence work, had in fact never even recognized that he possessed such skills, but the Army's failure to ask did not mean the skills were not valuable or needed. He had fed prisoners adequately according to regulations, treated them with proper respect, as the Geneva Convention required, and in the process of doing his assigned job, had naturally gained their cooperation and trust. He had talked with French civilians as any person might talk with local people, listened carefully to their stories and their knowledge, and learned what they freely chose to share. He had documented everything carefully and passed information through appropriate channels to people who could use it effectively. If military authorities considered that to be exceeding his authority, then perhaps, Washington suggested mildly, authority was being assigned incorrectly in the first place. The kitchen knife that appears in this story's title served primarily as a symbol, rather than as any kind of weapon. Washington used it daily throughout his service, preparing thousands of individual meals over the course of weeks and months. It was simply a tool of his professional trade, unglamorous and entirely necessary for his work. But in his skilled and purposeful hands, combined with his intelligence, his patience, his sophisticated understanding of human psychology, and his systematic approach to complex problems, it became part of an operation that removed 42 enemy officers from the field more effectively than combat operations could have achieved. The knife prepared food that kept prisoners adequately healthy and therefore able to provide valuable information. It demonstrated professional competence that earned respect even from prisoners. It was present during every conversation, every interaction, a quiet reminder that even the most basic and mundane tools, when wielded with genuine skill and clear purpose, could achieve extraordinary results that expensive weapons could not match. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, the German quartermaster officer who had worked alongside Washington in the chateau kitchen for several days, returned to Germany in 1947 after spending 3 years in various prisoner-of-war camps. He eventually wrote a memoir that included a brief but significant section about his time at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The American cook, he wrote with obvious reflection, had been completely unlike anyone he had been led to expect through years of propaganda. Competent and professional, thoughtful and systematic in his approach to work, and seemingly entirely uninterested in the racial hierarchies that German propaganda had taught Dietrich to expect in American society. Dietrich described learning, through their extended kitchen conversations about logistics and supply management, that virtually all his assumptions about America and Americans had been as fundamentally flawed as his assumptions about many other things he had been taught to believe. This realization, he wrote candidly, had begun in that chateau kitchen and continued throughout his captivity in various facilities, ultimately shaping his post-conflict work as an active advocate for democratic reform and reconstruction in West Germany. Ernst Weber, the intelligence officer with whom Washington had conversed most extensively in the wine cellar, became a respected professor of history at the University of Munich after the conflict. His academic work focused particularly on the psychology of military defeat and the complex process of ideological transformation. In a 1968 interview conducted for a documentary about the conflict, he described an American soldier he had met briefly during his time as a prisoner, a cook who had treated him with unexpected dignity during a period when Weber's faith in everything he had believed was collapsing. That treatment, Weber said thoughtfully, had powerfully suggested that alternative futures were genuinely possible, that one could abandon failed and destructive ideologies without necessarily abandoning personal dignity or hope. That defeat did not have to mean complete dehumanization or the destruction of all values. Washington himself rarely discussed his time at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont in any detail. After the conflict ended and he received his honorable discharge, he returned to Baltimore and resumed his civilian work at the Port Authority, eventually advancing to become a senior logistics director, responsible for coordinating complex shipping operations. He married, raised 3 children who all attended college, and lived what appeared from the outside to be an entirely ordinary and unremarkable life. When his oldest son, preparing a school assignment about family history, asked him years later about his military service, Washington described it quite briefly. He had been a cook in the army. He had prepared meals for American soldiers and for prisoners. He had tried consistently to do his job well, according to professional standards. The extraordinary details that would have made the story remarkable remained deliberately unmentioned, perhaps because Washington genuinely saw his actions as simply doing what obviously needed to be done in the circumstances. Perhaps because he understood intuitively that some operations succeed precisely because they remain unnoticed and uncelebrated. The chateau at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont still stands today. Its thick stone walls and graceful architecture survived largely intact. It now serves as a small but well-regarded museum dedicated to the Normandy invasion, with particular focus on the experiences of French civilians during the occupation and liberation. A single modest display case in what was once the kitchen contains carefully preserved artifacts from the building's brief use as an American headquarters facility. Among these artifacts rests a kitchen knife, standard military issue, American production from 1943, with a worn wooden handle and a blade that shows the marks of years of regular use. The small display card notes simply that this knife was used in the chateau's kitchen during June 1944. It does not mention who used it or what was accomplished in that kitchen beyond the routine preparation of meals. The full story remains largely unknown to the museum's visitors, who pass by without particular interest. Military historians who study the Normandy campaign in academic detail occasionally note an interesting intelligence anomaly from mid-June 1944. For approximately 2 weeks, intelligence gathered from the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont sector was unusually detailed, unusually accurate, and unusually sophisticated, particularly regarding logistics operations and supply networks. The sources were properly documented in reports as prisoner interrogations and civilian informants, all handled through appropriate military channels. What made this intelligence somewhat unusual was its analytical sophistication. Someone had not simply gathered disconnected pieces of information, but had systematically synthesized them, understanding how individual pieces formed larger patterns, recognizing how logistics intelligence, often considered secondary to tactical combat intelligence, could produce significant strategic advantages when properly analyzed and applied. The military establishment after the conflict studied this case, though initially without fully understanding its complete context. The demonstrated efficiency of information gathering from prisoners at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont suggested important possibilities for improved interrogation techniques in future operations. The successful integration of civilian intelligence sources demonstrated the significant value of local cooperation and cultural sensitivity. The systematic documentation of supply networks provided a useful model for future logistics intelligence operations. What the military initially failed to recognize was that this model operation had been conducted not by trained intelligence officers with specialized schooling, but by a mess cook who had simply recognized an opportunity and possessed the skills and initiative to exploit it effectively. African-American soldiers during the Second Global Conflict served almost exclusively in segregated support units, their substantial contributions often systematically minimized or entirely ignored in official histories written in the decades that followed. Washington represented thousands of black soldiers whose actual capabilities and potential contributions far exceeded the limited roles they were permitted to fill by military policies rooted in discrimination. The conflict, despite its terrible costs, opened limited opportunities for these men to demonstrate competence in ways the peacetime military structure would never have allowed. Washington's operation at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont exemplified how artificial restrictions on talent and ability, when circumstances accidentally created temporary gaps in those restrictions, revealed the enormous waste inherent in systematic discrimination. The strategic impact of Washington's intelligence gathering extended well beyond immediate tactical advantages in June 1944. The detailed understanding of German supply vulnerabilities that emerged from his work contributed directly to operational planning throughout July and August. Logistics targets were identified and prioritized, based partly on information gathered at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. German supply difficulties intensified significantly, contributing materially to the eventual collapse of their defensive positions across Normandy. None of this intelligence contribution was attributed in official records to any single source, of course. Military operations involve countless individual contributions, the vast majority of them properly uncredited. But the chain of causation, when traced carefully through preserved documents by dedicated historians, led clearly back to that chateau kitchen, where a cook had asked informed questions, listened carefully to answers, and understood what he was hearing. The humane treatment of prisoners at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont also produced measurable longer-term effects that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Post-conflict academic studies of German prisoners of war found strong evidence that prisoners who had experienced respectful treatment during their captivity were significantly more likely to support democratic reforms after returning home to Germany. The psychological impact of how captivity was experienced directly shaped political attitudes and civic engagement in the crucial Reconstruction years. Washington had not been consciously attempting to conduct psychological operations or political influence campaigns. He had simply been doing what he believed was morally right, treating prisoners as human beings deserving of fundamental dignity, regardless of the uniforms they wore. That this principled approach also produced strategic benefits for democratic reconstruction was almost incidental to his motivations. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont itself retained memories of June 1944 that emphasized unexpected and humanizing elements of liberation. Marie Blanchard, the village baker who had spoken extensively with Washington at the weekly market, later told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about the American soldier who bought vegetables carefully and asked thoughtful questions about life under occupation. He had been interested, she recalled, not primarily in extracting military intelligence, but in genuinely understanding how ordinary people had managed to survive, what they had endured, how they had maintained hope and dignity through years of occupation. Blanchard had provided both kinds of information willingly, but she remembered most clearly and most warmly that someone had cared enough to ask about civilian experiences with real interest. The chateau's wine cellar, which had temporarily held 42 prisoners for those significant 2 weeks, returned to its original and intended purpose after American forces departed from the building. Wine bottles, carefully labeled and properly stored, replaced military prisoners in the cool underground space. The cellar retained absolutely no physical evidence of its temporary wartime use, but the men who had occupied that space for those crucial days carried their memories of the treatment they received forward into peacetime Germany. Those individual memories, multiplied across thousands of prisoners who experienced similar respectful treatment in various facilities, contributed measurably to post-conflict reconciliation and reconstruction in ways that military planners and policymakers had never consciously anticipated or planned for. Washington's kitchen knife, now residing in its museum display case in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, represents a profound historical irony. It is displayed as a military artifact from the liberation, yet it was never used as any kind of weapon. It prepared food, not casualties. It supported life rather than ending it. But through that basic and necessary function, combined with Washington's intelligence, his systematic approach to complex problems, and his deep understanding of human nature, it contributed to military success more effectively than many actual weapons ever did. The knife symbolizes a truth that military institutions often struggle to recognize and incorporate, that competence and intelligence matter more than official authority or rank, that valuable capabilities can be found in unexpected places and people if organizations remain open to recognizing them, and that sometimes the most powerful tools for winning conflicts are the ones that feed and sustain people rather than harm them. The 42 German officers who vanished from Sainte-Marie-du-Mont during those June days did not disappear through violence, tragedy, or mysterious circumstances. They disappeared through a systematic process that began with battlefield capture, continued through careful and respectful management, and concluded with proper transport to established prisoner facilities. But calling this simply routine prisoner processing misses entirely the deeper and more significant operation that Washington conducted. He had recognized and seized an opportunity to gather valuable intelligence, to establish productive intelligence networks with local French civilians, and to positively influence prisoner attitudes toward democracy and American values, all while successfully maintaining his operational cover as nothing more than an efficient cook managing a mess facility. The operation succeeded precisely because it appeared from the outside to be nothing more than competent mess hall management by a conscientious non-commissioned officer. Lieutenant Morrison never received any credit or recognition for Washington's operation because Morrison never fully understood or recognized what Washington had actually accomplished under his command. This was not Morrison's personal failure or incompetence. Washington had deliberately operated entirely within his nominal authority as a cook, while simultaneously using that cover to conduct activities and operations far beyond that limited role. Morrison had approved each individual step separately, each one appearing entirely reasonable when considered in isolation, genuinely unaware that those seemingly routine steps formed together a sophisticated intelligence operation. This approach, operating carefully within bureaucratic rules and established procedures while accomplishing goals those rules never anticipated, represented a form of professional excellence that rigid military hierarchies often completely fail to recognize or reward appropriately. The long-term career outcomes for the various principals involved in this story reflected the harsh military realities of that time period. Morrison received routine promotions commensurate with his service and abilities, served adequately in various logistics roles throughout his career, and eventually retired with an honorable record. Henderson, the intelligence officer who had recognized the value of Washington's work and helped formalize the intelligence gathering process, advanced successfully through intelligence channels and retired years later as a colonel. Washington remained a corporal throughout his entire military service, despite his demonstrated capabilities, received an honorable discharge after the conflict ended, and returned to civilian life, where discrimination in advancement and opportunity had been absolute rather than merely pervasive. The fundamental unfairness of these divergent outcomes is difficult to ignore or justify. Washington's operation at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont had demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking, exceptional organizational ability, and considerable personal courage in taking initiative far beyond his assigned role. In a military that genuinely assigned roles and opportunities based solely on merit and demonstrated capability rather than on race, he would have been immediately identified for advanced intelligence work and very likely for officer training. Instead, he received no official recognition whatsoever because his significant achievements had occurred outside official channels and proper procedures. The medals, formal commendations, and career advancement went entirely to others. Washington received nothing except perhaps a museum display case holding an old kitchen knife, presented with no meaningful explanation of what that simple tool had actually accomplished in skilled hands. Post-conflict military reforms gradually, very slowly, began seriously addressing the systemic racial discrimination that had criminally wasted talents like Washington's and those of thousands of other capable black soldiers. The formal integration of American military forces, though incomplete and bitterly resisted in many quarters, represented growing recognition that artificial barriers to service based on race fundamentally damaged military effectiveness and contradicted American democratic values. The process of reform took decades to implement even partially. Washington himself never served in a truly integrated military during his time in uniform. But his grandson, enlisting in the American military during the 1970s, served in a force where advancement and opportunity depended significantly more on competence and performance and somewhat less on skin color and racial prejudice. Progress occurred, though far more slowly and far less completely than basic justice demanded. The specific intelligence gathering techniques that Washington had employed so effectively, particularly his systematic integration of prisoner interrogation with civilian source networks and his focus on logistics rather than purely tactical information, eventually became standard accepted practice in American military intelligence doctrine. Modern intelligence operations routinely emphasize exactly the kind of systematic information, synthesis and pattern recognition that Washington had performed instinctively based on his civilian logistics experience. The military establishment studied successful cases like Sainte-Marie-du-Mont extensively, usually without knowing or acknowledging Washington's central role, and carefully incorporated lessons learned into formal training programs and operational doctrine. Washington's innovative methods outlived him by decades, taught systematically to new generations of intelligence officers who never knew their true origin or the remarkable story of the cook who had developed them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.